Growing up, my family owned a farm on the outskirts of a small town. It was a peaceful place, with rolling fields, a weathered barn, and a cozy farmhouse. But there was one part of the farm that everyone avoided: the old well behind the barn. It was ancient, built from rough-hewn stones that were now covered in moss. My parents always told me to stay away from it, saying it was dangerous and could collapse at any moment. But there was something about that well that always intrigued me, even though it sent shivers down my spine. One autumn evening, when the sun was setting and the sky was ablaze with orange and pink, I decided to explore the farm on my own. My parents were in town, and my older brother was inside, absorbed in his video games. I wandered through the fields, enjoying the cool breeze and the smell of the earth. Eventually, I found myself near the barn, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of the old well. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and dread. The air around the well felt colder, like it was drawing the warmth from everything nearby. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the nearby trees, and I felt an inexplicable pull toward the well. I knew I shouldn't, but I had to see what was inside. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows were growing longer, and the light was fading fast, but I couldn't stop myself. I leaned over the edge of the well, peering into the darkness below. It was so deep that I couldn't see the bottom, just an endless black void that seemed to go on forever. As I stared into the abyss, I heard a faint sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. I froze, straining to hear. It was so soft, almost like a voice calling from far away. Goosebumps prickled my skin, and I took a step back, suddenly feeling very exposed and vulnerable. I was about to turn and leave when I heard the sound again, louder this time. It was unmistakable, a voice, whispering my name. Lily. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, expecting to see my brother playing a prank on me, but there was no one there. The farm was completely still. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant call of a bird. I turned back to the well, my pulse racing. The voice was coming from the well. Lily, come closer. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me, but I couldn't move. It was like the voice had a hold on me, drawing me closer to the well. I leaned over the edge again, peering into the darkness, and that's when I saw it, a pale face staring back at me from the depths of the well. It was ghostly, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin that sent a jolt of terror through me. The face was so far down, but I could see it clearly, as if it was right in front of me. It was a woman, her hair floating around her like she was underwater. And she was smiling at me, her lips moving as she whispered my name. Lily. Come to me. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The voice was louder now, insistent, almost pleading. I wanted to run, to get as far away from the well as possible, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The woman's face was still there, watching me, waiting for me to come closer. I shook my head, trying to break free from the trance. No, I whispered, my voice trembling. Leave me alone, Lily. The voice was desperate now, echoing in my ears. Please, help me. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to think. This couldn't be real, it had to be my imagination, a trick of the light, something rational. But the voice was so real, so clear, and the face. I could still see it in my mind, that twisted grin seared into my memory. Finally, I found the strength to move. I turned and ran, sprinting across the field, not daring to look back. The wind howled around me, and I could still hear the voice calling my name, growing fainter the farther I got from the well. I didn't stop running until I was inside the farmhouse, slamming the door behind me and leaning against it, panting. My brother looked up from his game, startled. What's wrong with you? He asked, frowning. I shook my head, trying to catch my breath. The well, I gasped. There's something. Someone. My brother rolled his eyes. You're just imagining things, Lily. That old well's been abandoned for years. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. And from that day on, I never went near the well again. Even now, years later, I can still hear that voice in my dreams, calling to me, begging me to return. But I won't. I know better now. Some things are better left alone. When I was a kid, I used to spend my summers at my grandparents' farm. It was one of those places that seemed stuck in time, with creaky wooden floors, a weathered red barn, and fields that stretched on forever. I loved the freedom, the animals, and the wide open skies, but there was one part of the farm that always made me uneasy: the old cornfield. My grandparents had long since stopped farming corn, but the field remained, filled with towering, dry stalks that rustled eerily in the wind. The rows were narrow, and once you were inside, it felt like the corn was closing in on you, cutting off the outside world. My cousins and I were strictly forbidden from playing in the cornfield, but that didn't stop us from daring each other to go in, especially at night. One summer night, my cousin Mark, who was a year older and always looking for ways to prove his bravery, challenged me and our other cousin Sarah to go into the cornfield after dark. The three of us had been sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields. The sky was a deep purple, with just enough light left to cast long shadows across the ground. It was the perfect setting for a spooky adventure. At first, I was hesitant. I'd always felt like there was something off about the cornfield, like it was watching us, waiting for us to step inside. But I didn't want to seem like a coward in front of Mark, so I agreed. Sarah, who was usually the cautious one, surprised me by agreeing too. She looked nervous, but there was a glint of determination in her eyes. We grabbed our flashlights and set off, our footsteps crunching on the gravel as we made our way toward the cornfield. The closer we got, the more oppressive the air felt, like the very ground was warning us to turn back. But we were determined till we reached the edge of the field, and Mark, being the ringleader, went in first. Sarah and I followed, the tall corn swallowing us up as we pushed our way through the rows. The stalks towered over us, blocking out the moonlight. The only light came from our flashlights, which seemed dimmer than usual, barely cutting through the thick darkness. As we walked deeper into the field, the rustling of the corn grew louder, almost like whispers. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there, just the endless rows of corn. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could tell by the way Sarah was gripping her flashlight that she was just as scared. Mark, trying to keep up the act of being brave, suggested we play a game of hide and seek. The idea made my stomach churn, but before I could protest, he turned off his flashlight and ran off into the corn, leaving us in near total darkness. Sarah and I stood there, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading away until there was nothing but the wind and the rustling corn. We waited for a while, calling out for Mark, but he didn't answer. The longer we stood there, the more the fear began to creep in. The cornfield felt different now, alive, almost. The whispers in the wind seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I was about to suggest that we forget the game and head back when Sarah grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I strained my ears, and then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping sound, like something heavy hitting the ground over and over. It was coming from deeper within the field. We both froze, our flashlights shaking in our hands. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, my mouth dry. "But we need to find Mark and get out of here." We started walking toward the sound, our fear growing with every step. The thumping grew louder, more distinct, and soon we could hear another sound beneath it, low, guttural breaths, like something was lurking just beyond the next row of corn. We turned a corner, and there, in the middle of the row, was Mark, standing perfectly still, his back to us. Relief washed over me. "Mark," I called out, running toward him, but as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Mark wasn't moving. He was just standing there, staring straight ahead. I reached out to touch his shoulder, and he jumped, spinning around with wide eyes. "Did you see it?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "See what?" I asked, my heart racing. There was something in the corn, he stammered. "I thought it was you guys, but it wasn't." Without another word, we turned and ran, pushing our way through the corn as fast as we could. The thumping sound was getting louder, the whispers in the wind more frantic, like whatever was out there didn't want us to leave. We burst out of the cornfield, panting and shaking, and didn't stop running until we were back on the porch, where the warm light from the house greeted us. We never spoke about what happened that night, not to each other, not to anyone. But none of us ever went near that cornfield again. I never believed in ghosts, not really. Growing up on my family's farm, I was used to strange noises and creaking floorboards, but I always dismissed them as the sounds of an old house settling or the wind playing tricks. But one night changed that. It was a late summer evening, and my parents had gone into town for the night, leaving me alone to look after the farm. I was 16 at the time, and while being alone on the farm wasn't unusual, there was something about that night that felt different. The air was heavy, and the sky, instead of its usual twilight glow, was an unsettling shade of deep purple. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I finished my chores and settled into the living room with a book. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making the silence almost tangible. I tried to focus on my book, but the stillness outside the house made me feel uneasy. It felt like something was watching me, waiting. Around 10 p.m., I heard a faint knock at the door. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. We lived in the middle of nowhere, and it was rare to have visitors, especially at this time of night. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and approached the door. The knock came again, this time louder and more insistent. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something in my gut told me not to open the door, but I couldn't just ignore it either. I took a deep breath and slowly turned the knob, opening the door just a crack. There was no one there. I stepped outside, peering into the darkness. The night was still, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind through the cornfields. I felt a chill run down my spine as I scanned the yard. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling of being watched was stronger now. I was about to go back inside when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, shadow moving near the barn. My blood ran cold. I could have sworn I saw a figure standing by the barn doors, but when I blinked, it was gone. I quickly went back inside, locking the door behind me. My mind was racing. Had I imagined it? I shook my head, trying to brush off the fear that was creeping into my thoughts. I decided to turn on the TV to drown out the silence, hoping that the noise would calm my nerves, but it did in single quotes. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows made me jump. I kept glancing toward the door, expecting to see something or someone on the other side. The minutes dragged by, and the feeling of dread only grew stronger. Around midnight, the power suddenly went out, plunging the house into darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I fumbled for my phone, using its dim light to find a flashlight in the drawer. The silence now was oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. The darkness outside the windows felt alive, like it was closing in on the house. I decided to check the circuit breaker in the basement, hoping to get the power back on. With the flashlight in hand, I made my way down the creaky stairs. The basement was damp and musty, and as I reached the bottom step, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "Get out." I whipped around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing there. My hands were trembling as I hurried to the breaker box, flipping the switches in a panic. The lights flickered back on, but the sense of relief was fleeting. The whisper still echoed in my ears, and I could feel a cold presence behind me, watching. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I wasn't alone in that house. My heart was racing, and I felt like I was being suffocated by the overwhelming fear that something or someone was in there with me. For the rest of the night, I stayed in the living room, every light in the house turned on. I didn't sleep a wink, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the dawn to break. When the first light of morning finally filtered through the windows, I felt an immense wave of relief wash over me. I never told my parents about that night, not in detail. I couldn't explain what happened, and I didn't want to sound crazy. But from that night on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark lingered on our farm, something that only showed itself when you were alone. And to this day, whenever I visit the farm, I make sure I'm never alone after dark. I've lived on my family's farm my entire life, and it's always been a place of comfort for me. The wide fields, the old barn, and the sprawling woods just beyond our property have always felt like home, but one night changed how I saw it all. I'll never forget the fear that crept into my bones, the kind that stays with you, making the familiar feel suddenly foreign and threatening. It was late October, and the harvest was nearly done. The days were getting shorter, and the evenings had that crisp chill that hinted at the coming winter. My parents had gone into town for a late-night meeting, leaving me alone to finish some chores and lock up the barn. I didn't mind being alone. I'd done it countless times. But that night, something felt different. I remember standing by the barn door, about to close it up for the night. The sky was overcast, and the moon was just a faint glow behind the clouds. The only sound was the wind rustling through the dry corn stalks. As I turned to head back to the house, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye, something darting between the rows of corn. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. At first, I thought it was just a stray dog or maybe a deer, but the way it moved wasn't right. It was too fast, too smooth, almost like it was gliding through the field rather than running. I stared into the darkness, my pulse quickening, but I couldn't see anything else. Telling myself I was just imagining things, I turned back to the house. But the uneasy feeling didn't leave me. Halfway there, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A soft, distant whisper carried on the wind. It was faint, almost like a sigh, but there was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was out there. I stopped dead in my tracks, listening. The whisper came again, this time a little louder, though I still couldn't make out any words. It was coming from the direction of the woods, the dark, tangled line of trees at the edge of our property. My first instinct was to run inside and lock the doors, but something drew me toward the sound. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was some twisted sense of obligation to protect my family's land. Whatever it was, I found myself walking toward the woods, flashlight in hand, my breath coming in shallow bursts. As I approached the tree line, the whispering stopped. The silence was so sudden and complete that it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. I shone my flashlight into the woods, the beam cutting through the darkness, but all I could see were the trees and the thick underbrush. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw a figure standing among the trees, just barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by shadow. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the light, a tree or a bush that my mind was twisting into something sinister. But then it moved. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my legs screaming at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot. The figure stopped just at the edge of the light, still too far to make out any details. And then, in a voice that was soft and cold as the night air, it spoke. Leave. The word was clear, but it didn't make sense. Leave. Leave where? The farm. The woods. The voice didn't sound angry or threatening, but there was something in it that sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I should turn and run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. One moment it was standing there, and the next, it had melted back into the shadows of the woods. The air around me felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name, and the whispering started up again, this time coming from all around me. That was enough. I turned and sprinted back to the house, not stopping until I was inside with the door locked behind me. I didn't sleep that night, and when my parents came home, I didn't tell them what I'd seen. How could I? It sounded crazy, even to me, but I knew what I'd seen, and I knew what I'd heard. And from that night on, I avoided the woods, especially after dark. The farm was still my home, but it no longer felt as safe as it once had. Something was out there, something old and restless, and I wasn't about to test its patience. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I've learned to live with the fear, to push it to the back of my mind. But every now and then, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear that whisper, telling me to leave. And I can't help but wonder what would happen if I didn't listen. Growing up on a farm meant I was used to quiet nights, the kind where the only sounds were crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. But there was one night, just before the harvest, that shattered that peaceful routine, leaving me with a fear I can never quite shake. It was late October, and my parents had gone to visit my uncle in the neighboring town, leaving me in charge of the farm. I was 15 at the time, old enough to handle the chores but young enough to still feel a twinge of unease when left alone. The day had been uneventful, filled with the usual tasks of feeding the animals and checking the fences. By evening, everything seemed in order. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, I settled in for a quiet night. I made a simple dinner, then curled up on the couch with a book, trying to ignore the creeping loneliness that came with the empty house. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and making the old house creak. I chalked it up to the usual groans of the old place, but something about it felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, an unsettling stillness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Around midnight, I decided to do one last check of the barn before turning in. I pulled on my jacket and grabbed a flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I stepped outside. The wind had died down, leaving the night eerily silent. Even the crickets seemed to have gone quiet. I made my way to the barn, my boots crunching on the gravel path. The barn loomed ahead, a hulking shadow against the starless sky. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it earlier, but the wind could have easily pushed it open. Still, my unease grew. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the smell of hay and animals filling my nose. Everything seemed normal at first. The cows were huddled in their stalls, the chickens roosting quietly. But as I walked further in, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. The back corner of the barn, where we stored the old tools and equipment, was unnaturally dark. My flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, the beam seeming to bend away from it. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but I forced myself to keep moving. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Just the darkness playing tricks. But then I heard a soft, scraping sound, like metal on wood, coming from that same dark corner. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as if something or someone was dragging a sharp object across the floor. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but I couldn't leave without knowing what it was. I edged closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. The scraping stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible whisper. I strained to hear, but the words were too faint to make out. I stepped closer still, my breath shallow, and that's when I saw it just beyond the reach of the light. A shadowy figure crouched in the corner, its back to me. It was tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. For a moment, I was too terrified to move, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Then the figure began to rise, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. The whispering grew louder, filling the barn with a cold, malicious energy. That was enough for me. I turned and bolted, sprinting out of the barn and slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back in the house, locking every door and window I could find. I grabbed the phone and called my parents, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. They assured me it was just the wind, maybe a stray animal, but I knew better. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and restless pacing. I didn't sleep a wink, jumping at every creak and groan the house made. When my parents finally returned the next morning, I told them everything. They checked the barn, but found nothing out of the ordinary, no signs of a break-in, no strange figures lurking in the shadows, but I knew what I had seen. And even now, years later, I can't explain it. The farm has returned to its peaceful routine, but that night still haunts me. Every time the wind picks up or the night falls a little too quiet, I remember that shadowy figure in the barn, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for another lonely night to come creeping back. Growing up on my family's farm, I always felt a strong connection to the land. The fields, the animals, even the old barn that creaked with age, it was home, through and through. But there was one night, a night I can never forget, that changed the way I looked at our farm forever. It was a chilly autumn evening, just after the harvest season. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear, revealing a sea of stars above. My parents had gone into town for the evening, leaving me alone to watch over the place. I didn't mind being by myself, I'd done it plenty of times before, but there was something about that night that felt different. The silence was thicker, almost suffocating, and the darkness seemed to stretch on endlessly. After finishing up my chores, I decided to take a walk around the property, as I often did before bed. The night was still, with only the occasional rustle of leaves to break the silence. As I walked past the cornfields, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It was an uneasy sensation, like eyes were following my every move. I laughed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild in the dark, but then I heard a low, distant hum, almost like a chant, coming from the direction of the old barn. It was so faint I almost thought I imagined it, but as I listened closely, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was rhythmic, like a pulse, and it sent a chill down my spine. I knew the barn well. It had been on our property for generations, filled with old tools, bales of hay, and memories of my childhood. But that night, the barn took on a menacing aura. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. I hesitated at the threshold, debating whether to go in or not. Every instinct told me to turn back, to lock myself inside the house and wait for my parents to return. But something compelled me to step inside. The interior of the barn was pitch black, save for the faint light of the moon filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. The hum was louder now, reverberating off the walls, and it seemed to be coming from the far corner of the barn, where the shadows were the thickest. As I approached, the hum morphed into a whisper, a chorus of voices speaking in hushed tones. My heart pounded in my chest as I shone my flashlight into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, just the usual clutter of the barn. But then, in the corner, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. There, amidst the shadows, stood a figure. It was tall, and naturally so, with elongated limbs and a face obscured by darkness. The whispers intensified, filling my head with a rush of unintelligible words. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence bearing down on me, filling the barn with an overwhelming sense of dread. I wanted to run, to get out of that barn as fast as I could, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. The figure seemed to grow taller, its shadow stretching across the floor toward me. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure began to dissolve into the darkness, the whispers fading with it. The barn was silent once more, the air thick with the scent of hay and dust. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually, I found the strength to move. I backed out of the barn slowly, keeping my eyes on that corner until I was outside, slamming the door behind me. I sprinted back to the house, locking every door and window, my heart still racing. When my parents returned, I told them what happened. They chalked it up to exhaustion, to the tricks the mind can play in the dark, but I knew what I saw, what I heard. That night, something was in our barn, something ancient and malevolent. I still live on the farm, but I never go near the barn after dark. Whatever was there that night, I'm sure it's still out there, waiting. The farm may be my home, but that night, I learned that even the most familiar places can harbor terrifying secrets.